For a long time, she endured the constant provocations and humiliations of her mother-in-law. She swallowed her words, ignored the sharp remarks, and convinced herself again and again that patience was the only way to keep peace in the family. But the last drop finally overflowed the cup of her endurance when her beloved fur coat disappeared without a trace. When her husband found out what had happened, he did not bother choosing polite words. His voice was firm, sharp, and final. "That's it. I've had enough. Pack your things and move to your sister's place." No one expected such determination from a son who had always forgiven his mother every whim, every outburst, every unreasonable demand. Hello, dear listeners. This is Andre Belli, and you are on the channel Kindred Souls. Today I present to you my new original story. Enjoy listening. Irina had dreamed of a fur coat since childhood. In the small village where she grew up, a good fur coat was more than just warm clothing. It was a symbol of prosperity, success, and status. It meant that a woman had made it in life, that she had escaped poverty and hardship. Irina still remembered how, as a little girl, she used to stare in admiration at a neighbor who would arrive from the city on holidays. The woman always stepped out of the car wearing a luxurious mink coat, her collar proudly raised, her movements confident and elegant. For Irina, that coat looked like something from another world, beautiful, unreachable, magical. From that moment on, the dream of having her own fur coat settled deep in Irina's heart. Years passed. She grew up, finished school, and eventually moved to the city. Life there was not easy. The city did not greet her with open arms. There was constant work, endless fatigue, and the feeling that she always had to prove something: her worth, her intelligence, her right to be there. Then she met Anton. When Irina first met him, she never imagined that her childhood dream would come true so soon. Anton was kind, calm, and reliable. He did not make grand promises, but everything he said, he did. Their relationship developed naturally, without unnecessary drama. They fell in love quietly but deeply. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Anton handed Irina a large, carefully wrapped box. She did not expect anything special, perhaps flowers, maybe perfume. But when she opened the box and saw what was inside, she froze. It was a fur coat. Not the most expensive one, not the most fashionable, but incredibly beautiful. Natural fur, soft, elegant, and warm. Exactly the kind she had dreamed of all her life. Irina burst into tears, clutching the box to her chest. "Why are you crying?" Anton asked, confused and worried. "Do you not like it?" "I like it," she sobbed, barely able to speak. "I love it. I didn't expect this." Anton could not know that this gift meant much more to her than just an expensive item. It was the embodiment of a childhood dream, the symbol of a new life, proof that she had not lived through all those hardships for nothing. But one problem darkened their family happiness. Zinaida Alexandrovna, Anton's mother. From the very beginning of their relationship, the future daughter-in-law did not please her. To Zinaida Alexandrovna, Irina was nothing more than a village girl with no education, no prospects, and no worthy background. That was how she spoke about her behind her back, and sometimes even openly. When Anton announced his decision to get married, Zinaida Alexandrovna threw a real hysterical fit. She accused Irina of mercenary intentions, claiming that the girl was only after her son's money and apartment. But Anton was firm. For the first time in his life, he did not give in to his mother. After the wedding, the newlyweds rented a small apartment. Anton worked as a manager at a car dealership. Irina found a job as a sales assistant in a clothing store. They lived modestly but happily, carefully saving money for a down payment on a mortgage. Zinaida Alexandrovna called her son regularly, asked about his life, his health, his work, but completely ignored Irina, as if she did not exist. Trouble came unexpectedly. Anton got into a car accident. He escaped with bruises and minor injuries, but the car was badly damaged and had to be written off. The insurance did not cover all the expenses. They had to take out a loan. And just a month later, the car dealership where Anton worked shut down. He was left without a job. The problems began piling up one after another. Anton struggled to find new work. Money became catastrophically scarce. That was when Zinaida Alexandrovna offered her help. She suggested moving in with them for a while, helping around the house, while Anton looked for a new job. Irina was strongly against the idea, but they had no real choice. The financial situation was desperate. At first, everything seemed fine. Zinaida Alexandrovna cooked, cleaned, went grocery shopping. But with each passing day, the atmosphere in the apartment grew more and more tense. The mother-in-law constantly criticized Irina. Nothing she did was good enough. Her cooking was wrong. Her cleaning was inadequate. Even the way she dressed irritated Zinaida Alexandrovna. "Don't you think that in worse situations spending money on cosmetics is unreasonable?" she said one day when Irina bought a new mascara to replace the one that had run out. Irina tried not to react. She kept reminding herself that this situation was temporary. Eventually, Anton found a new job. The salary was lower, but it was better than nothing. One evening, when Irina returned home from work, she noticed something strange. The wardrobe where her fur coat usually hung was empty. "Aunt Zinaida," she asked carefully, trying to keep her voice calm, "where is my fur coat?" "What fur coat?" Zinaida Alexandrovna replied, batting her eyes innocently. "The mink coat Anton gave me," Irina said. "I sold it." Irina froze. "What do you mean, you sold it?" "I told you," the mother-in-law said calmly. "There's no point in such an expensive thing hanging around unused. It's spring now, summer is coming, and we need money." "But that was my coat," Irina whispered. "My gift from my husband. How could you?" "Don't shout at me, girl," Zinaida Alexandrovna snapped. "I was doing this for your own good. You need money, not fur coats." Irina burst into tears. That evening, when Anton came home, she told him everything. To her surprise, her husband did not take his mother's side. "Mom, what have you done?" he said angrily. "How could you sell someone else's property?" "What do you mean, someone else's?" Zinaida Alexandrovna retorted. "It's a family item, and I am your family." "And where did you put the money?" Anton asked. "I'll tell you later," she replied evasively. "It's a surprise." Irina could not believe what was happening. Her precious fur coat, her dream, had disappeared because of her mother-in-law's whim. The next few days passed in an atmosphere so tense that it felt as if the air itself had become heavy. Zinaida Alexandrovna behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. She moved around the apartment confidently, cooked her meals, watched television in the evenings, and spoke to Anton as if the incident with the fur coat had never occurred. Irina, on the other hand, tried her best not to cross paths with her mother-in-law. She left for work early and returned late, lingering in the store longer than necessary just to avoid going home. Every time she stepped into the apartment, her eyes involuntarily drifted toward the wardrobe, as if hoping that the coat would somehow reappear, that everything had been a bad dream. But the wardrobe remained empty. Anton was torn between anger and confusion. He could not understand how his mother, who had always presented herself as caring and self-sacrificing, could commit such an act without even consulting them. He tried repeatedly to find out where the money from the sale of the fur coat had gone, but Zinaida Alexandrovna skillfully avoided the subject, brushing off his questions with vague promises and irritated remarks. The truth surfaced unexpectedly. One evening, while checking his mother's email on her old laptop, she had asked him to help fix something. Anton stumbled upon a confirmation letter from a travel agency. The subject line immediately caught his attention: "Booking confirmation, Turkey, 2 persons." His heart skipped a beat. He opened the email and read it carefully. A vacation package, a hotel reservation, 2 tickets, departure dates clearly stated. "Mama, what is this?" Anton asked that evening, holding a printed copy of the email. "What, did I ruin the surprise?" Zinaida Alexandrovna replied irritatively, barely glancing at the paper. "I wanted to make you a gift," she continued. "A trip for 2, for you and me. We'll relax together, just like before." Anton stared at her in disbelief. "And Irina?" he asked quietly. "What about Irina?" Zinaida Alexandrovna shrugged. "She'll be fine here. She'll work, take care of the household. Someone has to." Anton felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He could not believe the sheer audacity of his mother's words. "Mama, do you realize what you did?" he said slowly, trying to control his voice. "You sold someone else's property and used the money to buy a vacation without even asking us." "I was doing it for you, ungrateful boy," she exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "You've wasted away with that village girl. You need rest. You need to clear your head." At that moment, Irina entered the room. She had overheard the conversation and froze at the doorway, unable to move. Her ears were ringing, her thoughts tangled in disbelief and pain. "So that's where the money from my fur coat went?" she asked quietly. "On a vacation for the two of you?" "What's wrong with that?" the mother-in-law snapped. "Anton needs rest, and your coat was just taking up space." "My coat," Irina whispered, feeling a lump rise in her throat. "That's it," Anton suddenly shouted, his voice echoing through the apartment. "I've had enough. Pack your things and move to your sister's place. I will not allow you to treat my wife like this." Zinaida Alexandrovna was stunned. She was used to her son always taking her side, always justifying her behavior, always forgiving her. This was the first time he had ever spoken to her like that. "You're choosing her over your own mother?" she asked bitterly. "I'm choosing normal human relationships, Mom," Anton replied firmly. "You stole Irina's property and spent the money on your own desires." "You don't understand anything," Zinaida Alexandrovna scoffed. "I was thinking about you." "No," Anton shook his head. "You were only thinking about yourself." He told her that the next day he would take her to Aunt Raya's place. Zinaida Alexandrovna tried to argue, to protest, but Anton was unyielding. For the first time since the beginning of their marriage, Irina saw her husband truly stand up for her. The next morning, Anton drove his mother to her sister's house. The ride passed in silence. Zinaida Alexandrovna stared out the window, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Anton focused on the road, replaying everything that had happened in his mind. When he returned, he hugged Irina tightly. "I'm sorry for all of this," he said quietly. "I never thought she was capable of something like that." "You're not to blame," Irina replied softly. "She never accepted me." "We'll buy you a new fur coat," Anton promised. "I swear." "It's not about the coat," Irina said after a pause. "It's about respect. And I want you to know," Anton replied, looking her straight in the eyes, "there is no one more important to me than you." A week later they received a strange call from Aunt Raya. It turned out that Zinaida Alexandrovna had disappeared. She had taken all her belongings and left without saying anything. She was not answering calls, not responding to messages. He started calling hospitals, police stations, anyone who might have information. But his mother seemed to have vanished into thin air. Several days later, a message arrived from an unknown number. "I'm in Turkey. Don't look for me. I'll be back in 2 weeks." "She actually went?" Irina asked in surprise. "Looks like it," Anton replied thoughtfully. "Maybe it's for the best. Let her cool down. We'll sort out our own affairs during this time." And they truly began to do so. Anton took on extra work on weekends. Irina picked up additional shifts at the store. Slowly, painfully, but steadily, their financial situation began to improve. Zinaida Alexandrovna returned 2 weeks later, not to them, but to her sister's place. She spoke to her son only by phone, dryly and formally. She completely ignored Irina. And then a month later, something unexpected happened. Anton received a call from a travel agency. "Good afternoon, Anton Sergeyevich," the manager said politely. "We would like to clarify some details regarding your vacation to Turkey." "What vacation?" Anton asked in confusion. "I didn't book anything." "We have information that a trip has been booked in your name," the woman continued. "The payment has been made, but there are some inconsistencies in the documents. Your mother, Zinaida Alexandrovna, asked us to contact you directly." Anton was stunned. He had assumed that his mother had already gone on the vacation she had purchased with the money from the fur coat. As it turned out, Zinaida Alexandrovna had indeed traveled to Turkey, but alone and on a last-minute deal. The 2 tickets purchased with the money from the sale of the fur coat were scheduled for a later date, 2 months ahead, And who is the second ticket issued to? Anton asked carefully. To Irina Nikolaevna Shestakova, the manager replied. Anton could not believe his ears. The trip had been booked for him and Irina, not for him and his mother, as he had thought all along. That evening, he told Irina everything. I don't understand anything, she admitted. Why would she do that? I don't know, Anton replied, but I suggest we find out. They decided to go to Aunt Raya's house, where Zinaida Alexandrovna was staying. The mother-in-law greeted them coldly. Why did you come? She asked sharply. What do you want now? Mama, the travel agency called, Anton began. They said you bought tickets in my name and Irina's. So what? Zinaida Alexandrovna muttered. I thought you bought them for us, Anton said honestly. Don't be ridiculous, she snapped. Why would I travel with you when you'd just be missing your precious wife the whole time? Irina watched her mother-in-law carefully. Something about the story didn't add up. Irina could not take her eyes off Zinaida Alexandrovna. The older woman sat stiffly in her chair, her arms crossed over her chest, her face closed and unreadable. Yet there was something in her gaze, an uneasiness, a flicker of discomfort that Irina had never noticed before. Zinaida Alexandrovna, Irina began carefully, choosing her words with caution. If those tickets were meant for Anton and me, why didn't you say so from the very beginning? The mother-in-law looked away. I wanted to make a surprise, she replied curtly. And then you threw me out, so I got offended. But you told Anton that the trip was for the two of you, Anton reminded her. You said it yourself. I said it, so what? Zinaida Alexandrovna snapped irritably. Now we're going to remember every word I ever said? Then take your tickets and go, she added after a pause, and leave me alone. They left Aunt Raya's apartment in complete confusion. On the way home, Irina sat silently, staring out the car window. Streetlights flashed past her eyes, blurring into long lines of light. Her thoughts were tangled, emotions conflicting. You know, she finally said softly, I think she really did want to give us a gift, but something went wrong. What exactly? Anton asked. I don't know, Irina admitted. Maybe she was afraid we'd refuse, or that we'd think she was trying to buy forgiveness for selling my coat. Your mother is a very proud woman. Anton shook his head. That still doesn't justify what she did, he said firmly. Selling your coat was wrong. Of course it was, Irina agreed. But maybe we should give her a chance. They decided to invite Zinaida Alexandrovna to dinner. To their surprise, she agreed. The evening passed in an atmosphere of heavy tension. The mother-in-law spoke little, answered briefly, avoided eye contact. Anton tried to keep the conversation going, but every attempt felt forced. When Irina brought out tea and a pie she had baked herself, something subtly changed. Tastes good, Zinaida Alexandrovna said reluctantly. You've learned how to cook. Thank you, Irina smiled. I've learned a lot over this time. Later that evening, when Anton stepped out onto the balcony to smoke, Zinaida Alexandrovna suddenly spoke again. Don't think I wanted anything bad, she said quietly. I really was trying to do what was best for you. I know, Irina nodded calmly, but you could have just told us. Told you what? The older woman sighed. That I sold your coat to buy you a vacation? You wouldn't have accepted such a gift. You're right, Irina replied honestly. Because it was my coat, and only I had the right to decide what to do with it. You don't understand, Zinaida Alexandrovna said, rubbing her temples. I saw how you were struggling, counting every penny. Anton was exhausted. He needed rest. We both needed rest, Irina said gently, but not at the cost of my fur coat. Oh, stop going on about that coat, the mother-in-law snapped. A coat is just a thing. Anton can buy you another one. It's not about the coat, Irina said firmly. It's about respect. Zinaida Alexandrovna fell silent, clearly reflecting on her words. You know, she finally said slowly, when I was in Turkey, I thought a lot about you, about Anton, about us. I've lived my whole life for my son, and now he's grown up, he has his own family, and I feel unnecessary. You're not unnecessary, Irina replied softly, but you have to respect his choice, his wife, his family. And do you respect me? Zinaida Alexandrovna asked quietly. I try, but when you treat me like I'm nothing, it's hard. At that moment, Anton returned from the balcony. He looked at the two most important women in his life and smiled uncertainly. What are you talking about? He asked. About mutual respect, Irina answered calmly. And about the trip to Turkey. If you want, Zinaida Alexandrovna shrugged. You can go. It's your choice. In the end, they really did go to Turkey. The vacation turned out to be exactly what they needed. Warm sun, gentle sea, quiet evenings together. For the first time in a long while, they were able to forget about their problems, relax, and simply be together. And when they returned, another surprise awaited them. Zinaida Alexandrovna had renovated their apartment. Nothing major, just a small cosmetic repair, but it made the place feel warmer and cozier. This is my gift to you, she said awkwardly. Then she handed Irina a large box. Inside lay a new fur coat. Not as expensive as the previous one, but very beautiful. This isn't a replacement for the one I sold, Zinaida Alexandrovna hurried to explain. It's just a gift from me. If you don't like it, you can return it. Irina burst into tears. She hugged her mother-in-law for the first time since they had met. Thank you, she whispered. It's beautiful. 5 years passed. Zinaida Alexandrovna no longer lived with them. She had her own apartment, inherited from her sister, who had moved to another city to live with her daughter. But she often visited, especially after Anton and Irina had a son. Their relationship could not be called perfect. Sometimes they argued, sometimes they agreed, but now there was something essential between them: mutual respect. The story of the fur coat became a family legend. Every time someone showed too much confidence or tried to make decisions for others, someone would inevitably say, "Remember the fur coat story?" And everyone would laugh. Irina wore the new coat every winter, not because it was expensive, but because it was a symbol of reconciliation, understanding, and a new beginning. Last year, Zinaida Alexandrovna tried to arrange another surprise, a vacation for the whole family. But this time, she asked for permission first. And they went together: Anton, Irina, their son, and Zinaida Alexandrovna. It was their first vacation together as a family, and surprisingly, it turned out well. Sometimes Irina thinks back to that story and realizes that maybe everything happened for a reason. Losing her beloved coat was painful, but that experience helped them learn to respect each other's boundaries and become a real family. And that, she believes, is worth far more than any fur coat, no matter how beautiful it may be. After everything that had happened, life did not suddenly become easy or carefree. The problems did not magically disappear, and the wounds left by the past did not heal overnight. But something fundamental had changed inside Irina and Anton, something invisible, yet incredibly powerful. For the first time since their marriage, Irina felt truly protected. That feeling stayed with her even on ordinary days. When she woke up early in the morning and quietly prepared breakfast before work, when she stood behind the counter at the clothing store, folding shirts and greeting customers with a tired but polite smile, and when she returned home in the evening, exhausted yet calm. The apartment felt different now, not quieter, but safer. She often thought about that day when she had opened the wardrobe and found it empty. The pain of that moment still echoed somewhere deep inside her. It wasn't just about the fur coat. It was the feeling of being erased, of having her boundaries ignored so completely that someone else felt entitled to decide what was hers and what wasn't. That emptiness in the wardrobe had mirrored the emptiness she had felt in her chest. And yet that same moment had become a turning point. If Zinaida Alexandrovna had not sold the coat, if Anton had not finally stood up and said, "Enough," perhaps everything would have continued as before: quiet resentment, swallowed tears, silent endurance. Sometimes, Irina realized, pain forces people to speak when patience would have kept them silent forever. Anton too had changed. For a long time, he had lived with an unspoken belief that loving his mother meant excusing her behavior. He had grown up in a world where Zinaida Alexandrovna was always right, always dominant, always certain that she knew best. Standing up to her felt almost like betrayal. But when he saw Irina crying over the empty wardrobe, something inside him broke. In that moment, he finally understood that marriage was not about pleasing everyone. It was about responsibility, about choosing your partner not just in words, but in actions, especially when that choice was difficult. Sometimes late at night, Anton replayed that confrontation in his mind. His mother's shocked expression, his own raised voice, the realization that the boy who always forgave had finally become a man who set boundaries. It scared him, but it also made him proud. As for Zinaida Alexandrovna, her transformation was the most complex of all. For years, she had lived with the certainty that her son belonged to her in a way no one else ever could. His marriage felt like a theft, as if someone had taken away the purpose of her life. Irina, in her eyes, was not a person, but a symbol of loss. When she sold the fur coat, she truly believed she was doing something right, useful, necessary. She convinced herself that money mattered more than feelings, that her experience gave her the right to decide for others. And yet Turkey changed her. Sitting alone by the sea, watching strangers laugh, couples walk hand in hand, families build sandcastles with their children, she felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before: loneliness. Not the loneliness of being physically alone, but the loneliness of realizing that her place in her son's life had changed forever. She remembered Irina's quiet voice, not screaming, not insulting, just asking for respect. And that word echoed in her mind over and over again: respect. It was something she had demanded all her life, but rarely offered in return. When she came back and renovated their apartment, when she bought that new fur coat and placed it into Irina's hands, she wasn't trying to erase her mistake. She knew she couldn't. She was trying, in her own awkward way, to say something she had never learned to say out loud. I was wrong. Irina understood that. That was why she hugged her. The hug did not mean forgiveness without memory. It meant acceptance without surrender. It meant that she was willing to move forward, not as a submissive daughter-in-law, but as an equal. Years later, when their son was born, the dynamics changed again. Zinaida Alexandrovna became a grandmother, a role that softened her in ways nothing else ever had. She still gave advice. She still believed she knew best. But now she asked first, sometimes awkwardly, but she asked. And that made all the difference. Irina often watched her mother-in-law play with her grandson and thought about how strange life was, how one painful loss, a single fur coat, had reshaped their entire family. She wore the new coat every winter, not because it was warm or beautiful, but because it reminded her of something far more valuable than luxury. It reminded her that silence is not strength, that patience has limits, that love without respect slowly turns into pain. And most importantly, it reminded her that real family is not built on fear or control, but on boundaries, honesty, and the courage to say enough when it matters most. Time passed slowly, not in dramatic leaps, but in ordinary days that quietly stitched the wounds of the past together. There were no sudden miracles, no perfect mornings where everything felt light and effortless. Instead, there were routines, repeated, simple, sometimes exhausting. And within those routines, healing began. Irina learned that peace does not always feel joyful. Sometimes peace feels calm. Sometimes it feels boring. Sometimes it feels like finally being able to breathe without fear. She stopped expecting tension the moment she heard keys at the door. She no longer braced herself for criticism when Zinaida Alexandrovna visited. The air in the apartment changed, not because problems disappeared, but because respect had finally entered the space. Anton noticed these changes before anyone else. He saw it in the way Irina slept, deeper, without sudden movements, in the way she spoke, slower, more confident, in the way she made decisions, without asking for permission that was never needed in the first place. Marriage, he realized, was not about dramatic declarations of love. It was about consistency, about choosing the same person every day, even when it was uncomfortable. Sometimes he felt guilt for the years he had remained silent, for the moments Irina had endured alone, for the times he had told himself that things would fix themselves. They hadn't. They had changed only when he chose to act. And that lesson stayed with him. Zinaida Alexandrovna, too, lived with her own reflections. She never spoke openly about Turkey again, but the trip lingered inside her like a quiet echo. She became more careful with her words, though old habits still slipped through. Occasionally, she would offer advice without being asked, then pause mid-sentence, as if remembering something, and stop herself. Those pauses mattered. They were small, but they were victories. When Irina became pregnant, fear returned, subtle, hidden, but persistent. Not fear of motherhood. Fear of losing control again. Pregnancy made her vulnerable in ways she hadn't expected. Her body changed, her emotions deepened, and with that vulnerability came old memories of being unheard, dismissed, overruled. Anton sensed it immediately. This time he didn't wait. He went with her to doctor's appointments. He learned about things he had once considered women's matters. He defended her decisions before they even became conflicts. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply, firmly. And Irina felt it, that invisible wall of support behind her. Zinaida Alexandrovna struggled at first. To choose names, to suggest diets, to control schedules. But every time she crossed a line, Anton gently pulled her back. "Mom," he would say calmly, "we'll decide." Those words, repeated without anger, slowly reshaped their relationship. When their son was born, the room filled with a silence so deep it erased everything that had come before. Irina held the tiny, warm body against her chest and felt something she had never known, a fierce, quiet strength, not loud, not aggressive, but unbreakable. In that moment she understood something fundamental. She would never allow her child to grow up watching someone they loved being diminished. Zinaida Alexandrovna cried when she first held her grandson. Not the theatrical tears she sometimes used, but silent ones that fell unexpectedly. She looked at Irina differently then, not as competition, not as threat, but as the mother of someone precious. That shift changed everything. Years went by. The apartment filled with toys, laughter, small arguments, and warm evenings. Life was imperfect. There were disagreements, fatigue, moments of irritation, but there was no fear. Irina kept the fur coat carefully hung in the wardrobe. She didn't wear it often anymore. Motherhood demanded practicality. But every winter, she would take it out, touch the fabric, and remember how much she had learned because of it. It had taught her that love should never require self-erasure, that family should feel like shelter, not pressure, that boundaries are not walls, they are doors that show people how to enter your life properly. And sometimes, late at night, when the apartment was quiet and her son slept peacefully, Irina thought about the woman she used to be, the one who believed patience meant endurance. She smiled softly. As the years continued to unfold, life settled into a rhythm that once would have seemed impossible. There were school mornings filled with rushed breakfasts, forgotten notebooks, and small arguments about shoes left in the hallway. There were evenings when the apartment echoed with laughter, cartoons playing softly in the background, and tired but content silence. Irina watched her son grow with a quiet awareness that motherhood was not just about care, it was about example. She paid attention to the smallest details. How she spoke when she was tired, how she disagreed with Anton without raising her voice, how she reacted when Zinaida Alexandrovna offered advice that crossed into old habits. Because children learn not from words, but from atmosphere. And the atmosphere in their home had changed forever. Anton grew into a kind of father he had never seen modeled for him. He listened. He did not confuse authority with control. Sometimes when he watched his son play on the floor, he felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Pride for the family he had built, sadness for the lessons he had learned too late. But he did not dwell on regret. Instead, he turned it into intention. Zinaida Alexandrovna aged quietly. She never fully lost her desire to guide, to advise, to interfere just a little. But age softened her sharpness. She became more reflective, more aware of the consequences of her words. Sitting by the window in the evenings, she often watched the street below and thought about how different her life might have been if she had learned earlier what she learned too late. She never spoke those thoughts aloud, but Irina sensed them. Their relationship no longer required constant effort. It was built on mutual understanding, shaped by past mistakes and held together by respect rather than obligation. One winter evening, as snow fell gently outside, Irina took out the fur coat again. Her son watched curiously. "Mom," he asked innocently, "why do you keep that coat if you don't wear it?" Irina paused. How do you explain boundaries, dignity, and self-worth to a child? She smiled and said simply, "Because it reminds me of something important." That was enough. Years later, when her son grew older, Irina began to understand the full weight of what they had lived through. The conflict that once felt overwhelming now seemed almost symbolic. A lesson wrapped in pain, delivered at exactly the right moment. She realized that some families are not broken by conflict, they are shaped by it. What matters is not the absence of mistakes, but the willingness to face them. One quiet afternoon, Zinaida Alexandrovna sat beside Irina on the couch. The television played softly, ignored by both of them. "I didn't know how to let go," she said suddenly. Irina didn't pretend not to understand. "I know," she replied gently. That was all that needed to be said. No accusations, no defenses, just truth. And in that truth, something finally rested. As time moved on, the fur coat remained in the wardrobe, no longer a symbol of loss, but of transformation. It represented the moment when silence ended and self-respect began, when fear stepped aside for courage. When a family learned, painfully but honestly, how to coexist without control. Irina often thought about how easily her story could have been different. If she had stayed silent. If Anton had chosen comfort over responsibility. If Zinaida Alexandrovna had never faced herself. But life chose another path. And that path, though difficult, led them here. To a home where voices were heard, boundaries were respected, and love was no longer confused with possession. In the end, Irina understood something deeply simple. Strength does not shout. Respect does not demand. Love does not take. It protects. And that understanding became the quiet legacy she passed on, not through speeches, not through rules, but through the life she lived every single day. Life did not stop after the lessons were learned. It continued, quietly, steadily, in moments that no one would ever call dramatic, yet which carried the deepest meaning. The kind of moments that only become visible when you look back. Irina understood now that happiness was never a loud celebration. It was the absence of fear, the freedom to be herself without calculating every word, the certainty that her voice mattered, even when it was calm. She often stood by the window in the early morning, watching the city wake up. Cars passed, lights flickered on, people hurried somewhere with their own worries, their own silent struggles. And she thought about how many women like her once believed that endurance was the same thing as strength. She knew better now. Strength, she had learned, begins the moment you stop disappearing. Anton, watching her from across the room, sometimes felt overwhelmed by how ordinary their life had become, and how extraordinary that ordinariness was. He no longer felt torn between loyalty and love. He had learned that real loyalty does not demand sacrifice of one's partner. It demands clarity. He carried that clarity into everything, his work, his friendships, his fatherhood, and most importantly, into silence. Because silence, he now knew, could either destroy or protect, depending on when you chose to break it. Zinaida Alexandrovna moved more slowly now. Age had softened her steps and quieted her voice. She no longer tried to control the future. Instead, she observed it, with curiosity, sometimes with regret, but also with acceptance. She watched Irina and Anton together and understood something she had once refused to see. Love grows when it is not squeezed. Sometimes she touched the walls of the renovated apartment and remembered how she had once believed that money, effort, and authority gave her ownership over other people's lives. Those thoughts no longer brought pride. They brought understanding, and understanding at last brought peace. Years later, Irina's son would grow into his own questions about relationships, family, and respect. And when he did, Irina would not lecture him. She would simply show him, through the way she spoke, the way she listened, the way she never allowed love to cross into control. Because lessons taught through life are the ones that stay. The fur coat remained, not as a luxury, not as a memory of loss, but as proof. Proof that even quiet people have limits, that even patient hearts deserve protection, that even deeply rooted family patterns can change when someone is brave enough to stop them. Sometimes, Irina took the coat out and let her fingers glide over the fabric, not with sadness, not with anger, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that forced growth, for the conflict that revealed truth, for the courage that arrived exactly when it was needed. She had learned that love does not mean surrender, that family does not mean obedience, that respect is not something you beg for, it is something you require. And as life continued, ordinary, imperfect, beautiful, Irina felt something she had once believed was unreachable. Not victory, not revenge, but wholeness.